Flynn Hawthorne didn't move out to the country looking for a fight. He didn't move to find himself or escape some dramatic burnout. He simply wanted space, room to breathe, to live on his own terms, and to build a life rooted in dirt, weather, and the rhythm of the land. When he closed on the 7-acre property nestled just outside city limits, technically rural but bordering a large subdivision, he saw possibilities. A barn with bones, a creek running along the back pasture, and a house that needed love, not demolition. It wasn't polished. It wasn't convenient. But it was his. He came from a software job in the city. Late nights, tight schedules, endless meetings that left him numb. He wasn't a country boy by upbringing, but he wasn't afraid of work either. He read manuals, watched hours of agricultural YouTube channels, and started taking notes on rotational grazing and soil amendments before he even moved in. His vision wasn't about escaping society. It was about building something better, something honest and unintrusive. But some people don't like what they can't control. The day after Flynn moved in, he met Walter Brown. Walter didn't introduce himself like a neighbor. He approached like a landlord checking on a questionable tenant. Slacks, tucked in polo, clipboard. He didn't shake Flynn's hand. He pointed to a laminated pamphlet. "These are the Greenwood Estates HOA rules," Walter said. "We like to maintain a certain standard out here." Flynn blinked. "I'm not in Greenwood Estates." Walter smiled. "Tight." "Well, yes. Technically, your parcel sits just outside the subdivision. But we do like to keep the area visually unified. It helps property values. We'd appreciate it if you respected the guidelines." Flynn looked down at the list. No livestock. No fencing without architectural approval. No detached structures. No clotheslines. "I'll keep my cows out of your cul-de-sac," Flynn said, then turned and walked back to his truck. That was the beginning. At first, the interactions were mild. Annoying, but not alarming. Flynn would find small flyers in his mailbox, and signed but clearly from the HOA, reminding him that visible composting was unsightly, that external water storage violated the neighborhood's character, and that non-standard fencing materials reflected poorly on the greater community. He threw them away, but the letters escalated. Then came emails. Flynn still wasn't sure how they got his personal address, and after that, the reports. Walter filed complaints with the county about illegal farming activity. He claimed the barn was unsafe. He called animal control about Flynn's 2 Nigerian dwarf goats, alleging they were aggressive livestock. Nothing stuck. But each visit brought inspectors, paperwork, and wasted hours. Flynn documented everything. He kept a folder, physical and digital, tracking every complaint, every visit, every letter. He mounted trail cams on his gate posts and motion sensors on the barn. He didn't react. He recorded. But the attacks kept coming. The west fence was cut, once, then again. A newly painted barn door was splashed with dark paint. A letter showed up in Flynn's mailbox, handwritten in shaky block capitals. "Go back to the city. You don't belong here." The county couldn't prove who was responsible. The sheriff's office shrugged. "We can't enforce feelings," one deputy said. "But if you get footage, give us a call." Flynn adjusted the cameras. He set up a live feed and started cataloging footage each night. For weeks, nothing happened. Just wind, possums, and the occasional late-night raccoon raid on the compost pile. But then it happened. A figure, tall, broad, wearing a reflective safety vest, climbed the fence at 2:13 a.m. He walked to the barn, pulled out a can, and began spray painting the side. The camera caught his face as he looked up. Walter Brown. Flynn didn't call the police that night. He called an attorney the next morning. With the footage, the letters, and a clear pattern of targeted harassment, Flynn's lawyer filed for a restraining order against Walter and members of the HOA board. The case moved fast. The evidence was overwhelming. But what turned the hearing wasn't the footage alone. It was a witness, an HOA treasurer named Robin, who had quietly watched everything unfold. She testified that Walter had used HOA funds for security operations, approved by a fake subcommittee he had created. That he had encouraged board members to apply pressure to Flynn by filing complaints. That his wife, a zoning officer in the city planning department, had flagged Flynn's address in the system for enhanced oversight under false pretenses. The courtroom was silent when she finished. The judge signed the restraining order without hesitation and referred Walter Brown for investigation on multiple counts. The county audit revealed embezzlement of HOA dues, improper surveillance, and fraudulent use of zoning codes. Walter's wife was placed on administrative leave. Then the arrests came. Walter Brown, the man who once stood smugly on Flynn's driveway with a clipboard, was cuffed on his own front lawn, charged with harassment, vandalism, fraud, and misappropriation. Neighbors who had once walked past Flynn's property in silence now looked on in shock. The Greenwood Estates HOA dissolved within 3 months. The board disbanded. The bylaws were revoked. A final vote from the remaining members, many of whom had never realized what Walter had been doing in their name, formally ended the association. The subdivision, unburdened from its rules, slowly changed. People built gardens. Some put up sheds. Others simply stopped worrying about mailbox height or lawn grass length. Flynn didn't celebrate. He mended his fences, repainted his barn, and kept planting. But the tension lifted. For the first time since he moved in, a neighbor waved without hesitation. A woman from 3 parcels down brought over fresh eggs as a peace offering. Another neighbor asked if Flynn could help him build a chicken coop. Now that it was finally allowed. It wasn't utopia. But it was real. Flynn stood on his porch one evening, coffee in hand, looking out over the pasture. The goats were asleep. The fence held. The windmill spun slow. And for the first time in months, there was no email, no complaint, no patrol car idling at the edge of his land. He smiled. The peace he came for hadn't been handed to him. He had built it, and no one would take it again. Flynn never set out to be an example. But after the arrests, after the HOA dissolved, and after his name showed up in a small write-up in the county paper under the headline, "Property owner stands ground, HOA leader charged," things began to change. Not overnight, and not dramatically. But they changed. He didn't become a local hero. Exactly. There were no parades or ceremonies. No one asked him for speeches or podcasts. But people started treating him differently. They knocked before coming onto his land. They used his name instead of calling him the guy with the goats. Neighbors who had once watched from behind hedges now asked if they could walk his fence line and see how he'd installed the solar sensors. They weren't just being friendly. They were trying to understand how he had won.at first. He resisted the idea that he'd won anything. He'd lost time, energy, money. He'd lost trust. He'd spent sleepless nights wondering whether another tire would be slashed or another false report filed against him. But what he had gained, he was beginning to see, was something far greater than solitude. He had gained definition. When you draw a line and hold it, you don't just protect what's inside it. You teach the people around you what it means to have a line in the first place. And in places like Greenwood Estates, places where structure had been enforced through fear disguised as rules, that lesson hit hard. It started small. The new HOA-free community met at the local rec center. Not as a board, but as neighbors. Some wanted to keep a few basic rules in place, noise levels, trash pickup. Others just wanted to make sure nobody tried to reinstate the HOA. But nearly all of them wanted one thing, to never go back to how things had been. Flynn didn't attend the first few meetings. But Robin, the former treasurer who had testified against Walter, stopped by one day and asked if he considered leading a workshop. Not a formal event. Just an informal talk. People want to know how you documented everything. The cameras, the folders, the reporting trail. You made it stick. He agreed reluctantly. The community center smelled like burnt coffee and folding chairs. About 40 people showed up. Flynn stood beside a corkboard, clicking through photos of camera placements, copies of complaint letters, a few screenshots of Walter's zoning manipulations. No drama. No anger. Just facts. He spoke simply. They use noise and paperwork to scare me. So I use cameras and timestamps to hold them to their own standards. Someone in the back raised their hand. Why didn't you just move? Flynn's answer was quiet. Because I didn't do anything wrong. That line stuck. After that meeting, something shifted in the neighborhood. Not just toward him, but in itself. People who had once outsourced their voice to Walter's board began reclaiming their ability to think and decide for themselves. One man rebuilt his porch railing without submitting a sketch for approval. A woman painted her front door bright yellow. A group of neighbors tore out the cookie cutter community sign at the front gate and replaced it with a mural, a sunrise over a fence, with the words, "This land knows its owner." Flynn didn't help paint it, but he brought the donuts. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for Walter Brown were just beginning. The county charged him with 3 counts of fraud and 1 of harassment. The embezzlement charges stuck harder than anything else. Over $63,000 in HOA funds had been rerouted to dummy security accounts he controlled. His wife's involvement, flagging Flynn's property in the city zoning database as a sensitive site, led to a resignation from the planning office. When the trial came, Flynn was asked to testify. He didn't want to, but he did. He brought every document, every photo, every dated interaction. He sat in the courtroom, not as a victim, but as a witness with evidence. His testimony wasn't dramatic. It was cold, detailed, organized. It was, as one attorney said later, the most prepared civilian file I've ever seen. Walter was convicted on multiple counts. He avoided jail time with a plea, but he was banned from participating in any neighborhood association for 10 years and required to pay restitution. Flynn donated his compensation to a rural landowner legal defense fund. He didn't want the money. He wanted peace. And slowly, he got it. The land healed. Where the fence had once been cut, Flynn installed living posts, trees trained to grow into the wire structure. The barn was repainted, this time with his own handprints pressed into the wood, along with the prints of the goats. His compost pile grew. He planted more trees. Installed a rain catchment system. Built a bench near the pasture where the wind hit just right in the evenings. Neighbors began visiting more frequently, not with questions, but with ideas. How'd you set up that chicken run? What kind of seed are you using for that ripe patch? Think we could do a small market day at the gate? Flynn never imagined being part of a community, but here it was, not because he conformed, but because he refused to. And through that refusal, others had remembered they could choose, too. Years passed. The grass grew tall in spring. The creek ran high in winter. The fences stayed strong. Flynn built a small greenhouse beside the barn. He taught a neighbor's kid how to fix a solar inverter. He helped an older couple down the road install security cameras on their shed, just in case. He was no longer the guy with the goats. He was just Flynn, the man who didn't move, the man who documented, the man who built peace, one camera angle at a time. Time moves differently on land that's been defended. The days don't pass faster, they settle deeper. For Flynn Hawthorne, life after the fall of the Greenwood Estates HOA didn't shift into some heroic second act. It simply returned to the pace he'd wanted all along. Honest, quiet, uncomplicated, at least on the surface. But below the surface, something undeniable had changed. The land was no longer a personal escape, it had become a symbol. And symbols, whether you want them or not, start to cast long shadows. Flynn didn't notice it at first. He was too busy mending broken pasture lines, reinforcing the barn wall, and planting more late summer crops. But the phone calls started. The emails. The unannounced visits. Some came from neighbors. Others came from strangers. A family from another state drove nearly 4 hours just to walk the fence line and ask how to handle their own HOA dispute. They didn't ask for legal advice. They asked for clarity. What did you do when they first knocked on your door? Flynn answered them the same way every time. I didn't open it. I opened a folder. He wasn't trying to be cryptic. He meant it literally. Everything he'd done, the cameras, the timestamps, the printed screenshots and copies of letters, all of it had started with documentation. Not rage. Not confrontation. Just data, discipline, and a refusal to let anyone rewrite what was real. The word started spreading. Not just locally, but through online forums, landowner groups, and homesteading networks. Some called him the anti-HOA cowboy. Others called him a rural rights advocate. A few tried to turn his story into a brand. He shut that down quick. I'm not a movement, he told one group politely. I'm just a man with a barn. But the ripple continued. The county office implemented a zoning transparency initiative. Thanks to public pressure, most of it spurred by the exposure from Walter Brown's downfall, a new rule required all property zoning alerts to be reviewed by a neutral third party, not just city officials. Walter's wife had quietly resigned from her position before charges could escalate, and her influence in the zoning office was now a cautionary tale in real estate ethics seminars. A civic tech group in Austin published a case brief called Hawthorne vs. HOA, a model of civil resistance through evidence. It analyzed his timeline step by step, from the first letter he received to the final court ruling that led to Greenwood's dissolution. They used it to train legal interns. Flynn heard about this only when someone sent him the PDF. He didn't even own a printer. Back on his property, the changes were more subtle, but just as meaningful. Flynn had always imagined living alone. That was the appeal in the beginning. 7 acres, no neighbors within shouting distance, a barn to tinker in and space to grow what he wanted. But something had shifted in the people nearby. Where once there was suspicion or fear of standing out, there was now a gentle current of independence. People planted what they wanted. They painted without asking. A retired couple at the end of the road put in a stone path to a backyard chicken coop, something the old HOA rules would have forbidden. In no one asked for permission anymore. They talked to each other, not through forms or anonymous complaints, but over coffee, between passing trucks, or at the local feed store. And often, they credited Flynn, directly or indirectly, for teaching them how to push back, not with noise, but with knowledge. The idea of Hawthorne folders caught on. Flynn heard the term the first time from a teenage girl helping her grandfather with fencing repairs. My dad said we should keep a Hawthorne folder now, she told him. You know, in case anyone starts poking around. Flynn didn't say much. But later, when he was back in the barn, he laughed to himself. Not a loud laugh. Just the quiet kind that lives behind the eyes. He'd become a verb. But Flynn wasn't looking to be remembered. He was looking to be left alone. And now, he finally could be, mostly. Flynn never ran for office. He never joined a legal group. He didn't apply for nonprofit status, or attend conferences, or publish essays. But over time, his name found its way into places he never intended. City council notes, zoning policy debates, homeowner forums titled things like, How to Stand Up Without Starting a War. He didn't mind. He just didn't want to lose the land beneath his boots. His goats still grazed. The fence still stood. His compost piles grew deeper. But something in him had begun to shift. Not in ambition, but in awareness. He understood now, fully, that what he'd done wasn't just protect his boundaries. He'd redefined them. When a man refuses to fold, others remember how to stand. The neighbors didn't just change how they lived, they changed how they saw themselves. They no longer introduced their homes with lines like, We're in the HOA, so we can't. They started using phrases like, My place, our land, this corner of the county. Possession wasn't arrogance, it was reawakening. And Flynn, despite all his efforts to live quietly, became the one they turned to. A woman from 3 parcels down stopped by with her son and asked if he'd review a new property survey. Just want to make sure I'm reading it right, she said. Flynn did more than check the map. He taught the boy how to measure from the utility pole to the fence post, how to use online county records to verify easement language, and how to request a public access log of zoning adjustments. The boy was 13. Flynn didn't talk down to him. He handed him a pen and said, Write down what you learn. Someday you'll need it. That was how it spread. One conversation at a time. No press. No podiums. Just knowledge passed quietly, like fence wire from hand to hand. Eventually, the county clerk stopped by, unannounced but respectful. We're putting together a community accountability group, she said. We'd like you to consult, just informally, on rural protections, boundary education, nonprofit oversight. You don't have to speak much. We just want your eyes on it. Flynn agreed under one condition. No titles. I'm not a director or advisor or anything that gets printed on stationery. They agreed. He reviewed everything from proposed HOA reforms to building permit transparency procedures. Most of the time, he just circled the places where the language got vague. If you leave it blurry, he'd say, someone with a pen and an ego will take advantage. His comments made it into the final policy draft, verbatim, and while his name wasn't printed on the final ordinance, everyone knew whose eyes had sharpened the text. Meanwhile, back at his land, Flynn began building something new, not large, not public, but meaningful. He converted the back half of his barn into a space he called the Room for Memory. It wasn't a museum. It had no plaques or velvet ropes. Just shelves, boxes, binders, every HOA notice, every zoning letter, every complaint, every police report, every legal filing, every court transcript, every photo, every response. It was all organized, all labeled, all real. Visitors didn't just come to see it, they came to study. A young couple from out of state, building on an unincorporated plot near an aggressive HOA, spent a full day there taking notes. They left with a flash drive of templates, a checklist titled, If you ever get a letter, and a handshake from Flynn. No lawyer's going to care about your feelings, he told them. Care about your records. That room became something sacred. Not because of what happened in it, but because of what it stopped from happening again. Flynn never charged for access. Never advertised. But word spread, and those who came understood what they were looking at. Proof that an ordinary man, armed with paper and patience, could dismantle abuse disguised as structure. But legacy isn't built on paperwork alone. One spring, as Flynn was digging irrigation channels along his garden beds, a kid from down the road stopped by and asked, Can I help? Flynn nodded, handed him a shovel, and they worked in silence for a while. When they finished, the boy asked, Is it true you made the HOA go away with just your camera and a folder? Flynn leaned on his spade. Not just. I also didn't back down. That's the part people forget. The boy scratched his head. But wasn't it scary? Flynn looked out over the pasture. Yes. he said. But being silent while they win? That's scarier. Flynn Hawthorne never considered himself a teacher. He didn't enjoy speeches. He didn't enjoy crowds. His voice was steady, but quiet. The kind of man who spoke when needed, then got back to the shovel, the bolt, the feeding bucket, the soil. But teaching isn't always about the classroom. Sometimes it's the way a man builds a gate, measured, welded right the first time, level to the inch. Sometimes it's the way he answers a false accusation, not with yelling, but with files. Sometimes it's just presence. A man who didn't leave. A man who didn't yield. A man who remembered what he knew even when they tried to make him forget. That's why they kept coming. People brought their own problems, different than his but carrying the same shape. An HOA in Florida threatening foreclosure over a native garden. A widowed farmer in Utah fined for putting up a windbreak fence. Outside architectural standards. A retired Marine in Tennessee who built a greenhouse and received a cease and desist from a neighborhood committee that didn't even own the right to issue citations. Flynn didn't solve their problems, but he reminded them how to begin. You can't outshout them, he said. You outlast them. You outdocument them. You outstay them. He wasn't bitter. In fact, in his later years, Flynn seemed lighter. Not because he forgave what had happened, but because he saw the fruit of his resistance grow into something larger than a court victory. The land healed, and so did the community. The woman who once anonymously reported his compost pile now ran a co-op garden on her quarter-acre lot. The couple that once asked him to tone it down when defending his barn now had chickens and 3 raised beds of tomatoes. No one asked for permission. They just started living again, because Flynn had proven that permission wasn't needed when the law and the truth were already on your side. By his mid-60s, Flynn had reduced the size of his goat herd, leased out some pasture to a nearby vet tech school, and dedicated more time to mentoring younger landowners. Not formally. Not with job titles or schedules. Just early mornings and open gates. He held Saturday clinics once a month, not publicized. Word of mouth only. He called them land-proof sessions. A neighbor's teenager built him a sign, burned into pine. Land-proof. Come with your maps, leave with a plan. People came from 3 counties. Flynn taught them how to pull county plats, how to trace their property's original deed, how to challenge zoning overlays, how to request body cam footage from false sheriff calls, how to write formal rebuttals, and submit structured affidavits. No shouting. No fighting. Just clear defense, with paper, law, and discipline. Don't waste time arguing with someone who doesn't respect facts, he told them. Stack yours high enough they can't reach over them. He watched the culture shift slowly, like a slow-moving but unstoppable current. Fewer families folded under pressure. More stood up. They were quieter about it than the headlines liked, but that didn't mean they weren't making waves. Flynn's impact didn't make him rich, but it made him remembered. When he passed at age 72, peacefully, in his chair near the wood stove, no national paper covered the story. There was no monument. No social media trend. Just a note taped to the gate, written in someone else's handwriting. Because he didn't move, we learned how to stay. They buried him near the creek that first sold him on the land. Beneath a pecan tree, next to the fence he repaired with his own hands the day after Walter Brown's vandalism. There was no ceremony, just neighbors. People who had once feared letters in their mailbox. People who now walked their lines with confidence. People who could tell you, without blinking, what section and parcel their land sat in, and who it didn't belong to. The memorial wasn't in words. It was in fences that stayed up. In quiet barns, lawful gardens, and properties still owned by the people who earned them. Flynn left no heirs, no family to carry his name. But legacy doesn't require bloodlines. It requires proof. And the proof was everywhere. In counties with new ordinances. In HOA charters rewritten with transparency clauses. In youth programs teaching land stewardship before dead. In small folders tucked in kitchen drawers all across the state, each labeled Hawthorne. Not as tribute. As preparation, because someday, someone else will receive a letter like Flynn did. Someday, someone will stand in their yard, told to move or change or comply with rules written by those who've never seen their sunrise or walked their fence line. And when they do, they'll know exactly where to start. Not with anger, not with noise, but with presence, with preparation, with proof.